Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
What's going on, nieces and nephews? It is the GSMC College Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. How's everybody doing? I hope your weekend was great. I hope you found solace among all the loud fireworks and things like that, or you had some good food, socially distanced yourselves, and had a good time. I definitely had myself a good time. I stayed with the inner family and enjoyed my weekend. And that's all I can say on that. We have quite a bit to talk about today in the college football atmosphere. There's a lot of moving, shaking parts going on that I think a lot of people are starting to see a change in tonality and ideology among college football representatives and college football commissioners and things like that. But first, we have to go ahead and get into our first topic of the day, which is finishing off the college football Power 5 best top 10 returning players list. And where we end off now is at the SEC, the Southeastern Conference. We got 10 players. Here we go. Number 10 on the list is quarterback Kellen Mond out of Texas A&M. So Texas A&M's Kellen Mond has been one of the few quarterbacks to be a reliable option in both as a passer and as a runner. Mond has been better than most at his position and on the ground, particularly in his scrambling. Nearly a quarter of his scrambles in the past 2 years have resulted in a gain of 10 plus yards, averaging 8.5 yards per scramble, with 4.6 of those yards coming after contact. So he won't wow you in his arm strength by any means, but Mond has routinely made positively graded throws on his intermediate and short passes, ranking among the best 15 in the past 2 years at that rate. The dual threat signal caller has produced 2-year WAA totals that ranks among the top 10 best all-time best of all college football, and is one of the top SEC quarterbacks in a rather depleted quarterback conference in 2020. So that's Kellen Mond out of Texas A&M. Number 9, Patrick Surtain II from Alabama. So Patrick Surtain II has been an immediate impact player for the Crimson Tide. He started since week 4 of his freshman year in 2018 and has since produced a 2-year coverage grade that is among the top 10 best in college football. In his 28 career games, just twice has Surtain allowed more than 60 yards in coverage. In total, he's allowed a mere 0.69, so 0.7 yards per coverage snap over his career, and that's pretty solid for underclassmen. At 6'2", 203 pounds. It's near impossible to beat Surtain in a contested targets. He's forced 34 such targets, allowing just 9 to be caught, with 18 forced incompletions, while Stingley is number 1 in the SEC as a cornerback. Surtain is definitely easily one of the top returning defensive backs in the entire country. Number 8, running back Najee Himes from Alabama. With his past 2 seasons of play, Najee Harris from Alabama. With the past 2 seasons of play, Najee Harris could easily declare for the NFL draft and be among the first handful of running backs off the board. Harris had a 2-year WAA total that was of the 4th highest at this position and 2nd highest among returning running backs, and well as a 2-year rushing grade that was 4th best. The biggest thing Harris needed to show in 2019 was just any ability to produce in the receiving game, and he was virtually non-existent in that area before. In 2018, Harris saw just 4 targets. In 2019, he saw 33 and caught 27 with just 1 drop and 7 touchdowns. Regardless of the facet of play, Harris forced missed tackles regularly, doing so over a quarter of his rushes and over a third of his catches. He's one of the better running backs in the country, and my personal opinion, I feel like he might be the best one in the SEC, but that's just off of my eye test. Number 7 is wide receiver George Pickens from Georgia. So George Pickens' true freshman season could not have gone much better than it did. He finished as one of the 20 most valuable wide receivers in all of college football, displaying a massive catch radius and surefire hands. You would have thought that he had stickum on his gloves because the man would catch any catchable ball thrown his way. In fact, he saw the 3rd most catchable targets without dropping among FBS wide receivers in 2019. The fact that Pickens was able to generate a top 15 receiving grade on deep 20-plus yard targets as a true freshman is quite impressive. Jake Fromm wasn't the sharpest deep passer, so Jamie Newman and now throwing Pickens the ball. The Bulldogs have easily the best quarterback receiver duo in the SEC and one of the best in the country. All right, number 6 is linebacker Nick Bolton out of Missouri. So in losing Cale Garnett mid-season due to injury, Missouri was without the highest graded linebacker in coverage, but Nick Bolton stepped up and shined in every facet of play. In his only collegiate season as a starter, he finished as one of the 3 highest graded players in the position, and when it mattered most in coverage, Bolton was at his best, posting a elite 90.4 coverage grade and allowing just 180 yards on 352 coverage snaps with 10 combined pass breakups and interceptions on his 29 targets. There was only one other off-ball linebacker to produce more in a WAA in 2019 than Bolton, and he is one of the best, if not the best, returning at the position. So look out for him at Missouri. Number 5 on the list is wide receiver Jalen Waddle from Alabama. So he's seen limited action behind Alabama's stacked wide receiver unit, but Jalen has had a few negatives in his play in the first 2 collegiate seasons over the past 2 years. Only one other wide receiver has generated more wins over average and a higher slot receiving grade than Jalen Waddle, and that was CeeDee Lamb. It's a pretty good company to be in, considering Lamb is about to be at the time of this ranking, he was about to be a top 15 pick in the NFL 2020 draft. And given an open field, Waddle, who reportedly can run a 4.37 40-yard dash coming out of high school, so he would surely take advantage of it and explode after the catch. On targets in the slot with open separation, so that's more than a couple of steps, Waddle averaged 13 yards after the catch per reception, which also tacking on 14 broken tackles when defenders tried to catch him. We didn't see him go up against some of the elite corners, but it made some players at the opposing defense look like they were belonging on a JV squad. So that justifies his 5th ranking here. Number 4 is Devonta Smith from Alabama, and everybody's had their eyes peeled on Jerry Jeudy and speedster Henry Ruggs III when tuning into Alabama this past season, but Devonta Smith was just as good as those 2 soon-to-be gone first rounders at the time. So Smith was lethal after the catch and could generate separation against any cornerback he faced with his elite speed, especially going against press coverage on those snaps. Smith posted the highest raw Pro Football Focus grade per snap and averaged nearly 30 yards per catch, 5 yards more than any other receiver. With his ability to create after the catch, he had the 5th most yards after catch per reception and 15 broken tackles on 67 catches. Great hands. He had 0 drops when targeted beyond the sticks and crisp route running. Smith is not only the 4th returning player in the SEC, but the 2nd top returning wide receiver in the entire country. And if you were to see, there are 42 plays in 2019 which Alabama put out Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, Devonta Smith, and Jalen Waddle, and the results were 7 of 8 Jerry Jeudy with 122 yards and 1 touchdown. Ruggs with 6 of 8 with 148 and a touchdown. Smith with 7 out of 10 with 176 for 3 touchdowns, and Waddle with 5 of 6, 118 yards, 2 touchdowns. And this might be one of the craziest wide receiver bundles we've ever seen in college football. All right, moving on to number 3, Jamie Newman of Georgia. So due to Joe Burrow, Tagovailoa, and Jake Fromm departing to the NFL, the SEC quarterbacks were beginning to look a little bit weak. But that was until Jamie Newman transferred into the conference from Wake Forest. His situation at Wake Forest wasn't necessarily the best. The offense was up-tempo, RPO-based, and wasn't necessarily utilizing Newman's rushing ability more than it probably should have. While the 6'4", 230-pound Newman owns the athleticism to run with the ball, his arms are far better. No quarterback has forced to throw into tight windows more than Newman was last season, and he overcame that to produce the second highest passing grade on those throws, only behind Joe Burrow, and the third lowest rate of uncatchable passes. Newman's arm strength and accuracy will give Georgia an added boost to their deep passing game, an area in which it was average in at best last season. So on throws of 20-plus yards, Newman once again trailed only Joe Burrow in Pro Football Focus passing grade. Newman dropped some absolute bombs while giving the defense minimal opportunities to make a play on the ball downfield. And with Newman, a run for the national championship is very realistic for Georgia. Number 2 is wide receiver Jamar Chase. So LSU's Jamar Chase was the 4th highest graded wide receiver in the country last season, and it wasn't even draft eligible. So the reigning award winner bodied his opponents downfield and was near impossible to cover in a single coverage. On those plays, Chase produced a 97 Pro Football Focus receiving grade, 32 explosive plays, 15-plus yard gains, 11 broken tackles, and 14 catches on 28 contested targets. For perspective, the next closest wide receiver by that grade was a 93.9, and those 32 explosive plays were 7 more than anybody else. Chase was among the 5 most productive receivers in Power 5 conferences and is the best deep threat returning into college football. He has 6 more catches on 20-plus yard targets than anyone else and had the most receptions that resulted in a gain of 50-plus yards. He had 9 of them. LSU is going to miss Joe Burrow, of course, considering he had the best season we have ever seen in college football since the grading of Pro Football Focus's inception. But they'll be in great hands with another 2 most valuable positions on the field, with Stingley out at corner and Chase out wide. Now, number 1 returning to the SEC is Derek Stingley Jr., LSU. Not only is Derek Stingley Jr. the top returning player in the SEC, he's also considering certainly the top returning non-quarterback in all of college football. In his 2019 true freshman campaign, Stingley produced a 91.9 coverage grade that led all FBS cornerbacks. There wasn't a better cornerback in the country at that catch point than Stingley. He forced tight coverages and contested targets at an absurdly high rate over 3/4 of the time, in fact, and remained far and away the highest graded cornerback on those plays. On contested targets, Stingley allowed just 9 of 33 to be caught while picking up off 5 and forcing 19 completions. Many will be quick to say, but what about the Alabama game? Devonta Smith torched him. Of course, when they see this, but while that may be true, Stingley routinely shut down his opposition over the course of the season. Stingley allowed just 38% of catch rate on his 96 targets and showed press man skills that NFL teams look for. The Bama game was a blemish and the worst of his season, but he came up huge almost all of the games against top 10 competition. So that is where we have that. And just some quick stats. When he faced number 9 Texas, he had 64 coverage snaps. He had 4 targets. There was only 2 receptions given up, 20 yards, and 2 interceptions and pass breakups. So that's also included. So interceptions plus pass breakups are both included. Number 7 at Florida. So he had 52 coverage snaps, 12 targets, 8 receptions given up for 103 yards. He gave up a touchdown, but he had interception pass breakups of 2. At Auburn, it was 44 coverage snaps at 10 targets, only 2 receptions, giving up 50 yards and 1 interception or pass breakup. At Alabama, of course, it was 45 coverage snaps. He had 6 targets and gave up 5 of them, and 211 yards, gave up 2 touchdowns. That was his worst game by far in the season. Against number 4 Georgia, he had 50 coverage snaps and 16 targets. He only gave up 5 for 57 yards and 1 touchdown, where he had an interception and a couple pass breakups in that. At Oklahoma, 37 coverage snaps, 3 targets, 1 reception, giving up 13 yards in that game. He was shut down. At Clemson, 48 coverage snaps, only 6 targets for 1 reception, giving up 12 yards in that 1 target, and he had no interception or pass breakup. So he was also pretty shut down in that one as well. So quickly to go back over who we just spoke about. Number 10 is Kellen Mond out of Texas A&M, quarterback. Number 9 is cornerback Patrick Surtain, the second out of Alabama. Number 8 is running back Najee Harris from Alabama. Number 7 is wide receiver George Pickens from Georgia. Number 6 is linebacker Nick Bolton from Missouri. Number 5 is wide receiver Jalen Waddle from Alabama. Number 4 is Devonta Smith, wide receiver from Alabama. Number 3 is quarterback Jamie Newman from Georgia. Number 2 is wide receiver Jamar Chase from LSU. And number 1 is cornerback Derek Stingley Jr. from LSU. Those are your top 10 returning players to this season 2020 of the SEC. We're going to take our first break, and coming out, we're going to get into more college football conversations. This is the GSMC.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, we're back, GSMC College Football Nation, and we are going to get into a little bit of a rapid fire news segment here, talking about some smaller pieces of the college football atmosphere. And I know it's been a while since we did a little bit of a news blurb back to back, but I feel like we are starting to get a lot more things going down the pipeline as the inevitable decision of whether or not we're going to see college football return in the fall this year is starting to come to a climax, so to speak, for a lot of different universities, a lot of different conferences, and a lot of different groups and structures. Maybe not so much for the Power Five as of yet, but we're seeing a lot of different things move and shake in the college football realm. So first on the list, of course, Jimbo Fisher received a 6-month show cause order for Texas A&M recruiting violations. So remember a few months back, we were talking about how Jimbo Fisher, after he left, really hurt their chances, or Florida State's chances, in recruiting. And we saw a big drop off from the Jameis era to, since really 2016, we've really seen a tail off that was a big fall off. And it's almost as dramatic as Florida State being kind of top dogs of the first half of the decade, and then boom, we get Clemson from the ACC. It's like you can't have both. So it was like a flip-flop situation. Anyway, Jimbo Fisher is one of those catalysts in that flip-flop. And the NCAA announced Thursday that the head coach received a 6-month show cause order after he and an assistant coach had impermissible contact with a high school recruit. The violations outlined by the NCAA occurred between January 2018 and February 2019. The impermissible conversation occurred before the prospect completed his junior year of high school According to the NCAA, Fisher failed to promote an atmosphere of compliance because of his personal involvement in the recruiting violation. The investigation also revealed that the program unintentionally caused players to exceed the allowable number of countable athletically related activity hours by 7. The NCAA said Fisher failed to monitor his staff and did not ensure they were staying within the allowable hours. Under his show cause order, Fisher is banned from all off-campus recruiting activities for the fall 2020 contract period. Fisher released a statement through the school on the violations. As the Texas A&M head coach for the football team, he is responsible for promoting and monitoring for NCAA compliance in his program. He says, while I am disappointed in the violations, including an unintended one that resulted from a conversation with a high school athlete, it is still my responsibility to ensure we are adhering to each and every rule. Fisher said, I am pleased to have this matter completely behind our program and look forward to continuing our efforts to make every aspect of our program one for all Aggies can continue to be proud of. The Aggies' penalties include 1 year of probation, a $5,000 fine, and the school was forced to end its recruitment with the prospect. The program also received an off-campus recruiting ban from the coaching staff that took place in November 2019 and will not be allowed to recruit any players from that recruit's high school through the end of the 2021-2022 school year. Fisher's show cause order includes a previously served 9-day ban on phone calls, emails, and texts with prospects in January 2020, a reduction in off-campus recruiting contact days by 3 for December 2019 through January 2020 contract period, a ban of all off-campus recruiting activities for fall 2020 contract period, and additionally one-on-one rules education. In the seasons with the Aggies, Fisher has gone 17 of 9 overall and 9 of 7 in conference play. Okay, so that's a good bit of roundup from what we've been seeing, because this isn't something really new, but we kind of got a conclusion to something that might have been lost in translation over the last couple months, and now we have conclusion. Now we're going to get into Kansas, as Kansas had to suspend their workouts after 12 players tested positive for COVID-19. So Kansas has suspended voluntary workouts over an increased coronavirus case in the Jayhawks program. The university suggests all players and coaches should self-quarantine for 14 days, given the recent spike in the program and the surrounding community. Once the quarantine period is over, student athletes and staff will be retested to determine whether conditioning activities will resume at that time. After testing 164 student athletes, 16 people were tested positive, with 12 of those being football players. A total of 45 athletes are currently in quarantine. After increase in positive COVID-19 tests within in our football program, they say, our medical team at Kansas Team Health has recommended discontinuing voluntary workouts immediately. Our priority remains to keep our student athletes safe and healthy, especially during the pandemic, and will follow the recommendations of our medical professionals. That's what the director of athletics, Jeff Long, said in a statement. Kansas said all other sports that have returned to campus will continue their voluntary workouts at this time, and if positive tests increase, the school will follow recommendations from health officials and suspend additional sports activities as needed. This week, the state of Kansas has reported 1,459 new coronavirus cases. As college football teams return to campuses, some teams have seen high numbers of athletes testing positive for COVID-19, although many are asymptomatic. Earlier this month, of course, we saw Houston suspended all voluntary workouts for football and men's and women's basketball after 6 students tested positive. Clemson's football program had recorded 37 coronavirus cases over the past month, and as of Friday, the school's athletic program had a total of 47 positive results after conducting 430 tests since June 1st. So this is something that is going to continue to happen in Power 5 schools and across the country at all FBS schools, the 130. We're going to just see more and more of these as time goes on, because there is no way to really hinder it down if you're going to start college football. These kids are coming back from all different parts of the country, all different parts in different states with different regulation rules, different stay-at-home orders, different parts of the reopening terms and things like that. So we are getting to a point where these kids are coming back to school, and not only they are coming back to school, we're seeing news about different universities, of course, opening up once again, getting ready for the fall. So people are coming back, professors may be back on campus at some point, and it's starting to accumulate more people around in that condensed area on campus. We're going to see more of these cases, and it's just going to keep happening until we see a conservative effort to nip it in the bud, so to speak. And we're going to talk more about that in the third segment. But right now, we're going to get into what Lincoln Riley said, Oklahoma head coach. He thinks spring football season is a very doable thing, as colleges and conferences nationwide take every measure to ensure the sport will take place as scheduled for the fall. Lincoln Riley thinks that the idea of spring football is very doable. He says, I think that people who say it's not an option, in his opinion, just don't want to think about it. Riley said on Friday, per ESPN's David Wilson, I think it just would be wrong for us to take any potential option off the table right now. And I think that it's difficult to say the spring is not a potential option. I, for one, think it's very doable. In May, Riley urged caution when it came to bringing players back on campus, but was confident the 2020 season would happen, emphasizing, we got a shot at this. In my opinion, we need to bring them in as late as we possibly can before we play a season, Riley said. Every day we bring them in is a day we could have gotten better. In the day, we could have learned more about the virus, so we got to be patient. We've got one shot at this, and we're going to have to do it right. Riley still believes that the season can proceed as planned for the fall and hold out hope that the Sooners will be able to play their season opener on September 5th against Missouri State. I hope like hell we can play in the fall and do it as close as we have always done it before, Lincoln said. If we can do that, I'm all for it, and if that's the best option. But we've seen, at least right now, that the hot weather doesn't affect this virus very much, which we kind of hoped for it would. In the college football season, were shifted into the spring, Riley speculates that it would only include conference games and the postseason. He cited that under normal circumstances, the teams that make it to college football playoff practice in January, and some programs begin spring practice in February, so playing a season in the spring wouldn't be as extreme a departure from normally as it may sound. After 14 players tested positive, Riley said that he wasn't surprised and that his program certainly wasn't expecting zero going forward. He's preparing his team as the season is going to occur on time while taking necessary precautions. At some point, you do have to practice football, and it's tough to do that without two people close to each other, Riley said, and it's hard to go to the next step until you've done the one before it. And he says, I think I want to take our time and see how it plays out. Lincoln Riley sounds like he's taking this as a level-headed coach, and as about as level-headed as anybody else could at this moment in time. And I like how he's trying to paint this idea of keeping options open, because at this point, the NCAA, a lot of different coaches or a lot of different people on committees have been really, really wary of saying, yeah, I'm open to the idea of a spring football season. And more, we're starting to see people speak out about having spring football, because right now the fall timeline is looking a little bleak. It's not looking like something that can realistically happen without problems. It doesn't seem like there's going to go smooth without a hitch if you start in the fall. And I think a lot of people are starting to come to that realization that that is just not something that is going to be easily changed. That you can't replicate a 2019 season without coronavirus, because you still are going to deal with it for the better half of the next 8 to 10 months, depending on if we can get a vaccine in earlier than we expect. It's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. And December, even November through January through February, when it's still cold in many places, it's going to be extremely, extremely hard to deal with people still playing games, people still being around each other. Schools are trying to open back up. It's going to be a challenge, and it's good to have options. It's good to not just take things off the table when you have no idea which options are going to end up taking themselves off the table in the long run. So Lincoln Riley, speaking out on this, being one of the more prolific one of the more prolific college football coaches in the game, is a good look for the NCAA, because if you collectively shut something down, that may potentially save a lot of people's seasons and a lot of people's revenue. That may end up being a bad look. And Lincoln Riley has been in a good spot as of recent. He got Caleb Williams over LSU and some other major schools under consideration, and he is the top dual threat quarterback in the ranked 300 class. So that's awesome for Lincoln Riley. And we all know how this means. Like, a dual threat quarterback in Lincoln Riley's system is just going to put up statistics. They're going to put up some big numbers. And I know Lincoln Riley is very, very eager to get that guy into the program when he's ready to go. So I know that he wants to continue to look towards this season, but let's not forget, a lot of these coaches, they look towards the future too, and they want to be able to salvage any sort of part of their future as possible. And, as much as current events run our world, college football is just half the battle of current events. It's no longer just about current events. You got to make sure you keep up to date with people bringing in certain prospects in certain years, because it affects you. If you're a coach somewhere else or in the same conference, it will affect you, and competition never stops. But we're going to take another break here, and then we're going to get into what was spoken about at the summit this week for college football. It's the GSMC.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, college football fans, we are coming back to the GSMC College Football Podcast, and previously we were talking about news of the week, and of course our top 10 returning players of the SEC, and now we're about to get into the nitty-gritty. Capitol Hill usually is a place where we've been talking about name, image, and likeness legislature for the better half of the last 6 months. Today, though, we're going to be talking about a little bit more than that, as the real main focus point of the Name, Image, and Likeness Summit at Capitol Hill really attacked coronavirus, as the NCAA, according to lawmakers around the country and at the meeting at the summit, have been very critical of how they've been treating the virus as far as what they're doing with student athletes and how they perceive the season is going to start or if it's going to start at all. So they chastise schools making athletes sign waivers. So some schools have been making athletes sign waivers as recent to return back to college sports and to play. So that is something that they are not very fond of in Capitol Hill, and it is something that really, really seems a bit twisted. So as a growing concern, the athletic directors fear that potential large numbers of athletes in quarantine. The officials are rekindling discussions of spring football seasons being started, like we talked about earlier. And while people are still focused on the Labor Day weekend kickoff, Sankey, who is the SEC athletic director, I believe, or athletic committee chairman, he acknowledges that the unprecedented events happening across campuses, it certainly is not comfortable to see what's going on around us, he told Sports Illustrated in an interview after the hearing. So when you look at contingencies, they've always been one of the elements out of 18 to 20 possibilities when you have to think about, he says, what will you know in January that will be different? It is difficult to predict. We have to be careful in our decision making, and even amidst the concerning data now, we have to make sure that we take care of our young people first, and we'll see what happens through July to make those decisions. Sankey says a deadline date to determine if the football season can be played remains unknown, but he noted a window of time from now until the start of traditional camps, which begins the first week of August. Meanwhile, his optimism has waned. So on June 1st, Mr. Carter says, I was really optimistic about everything, but I'm less optimistic today about a normal start. He told SI after the hearing, we may start on time, but as far as what our crowds look like, that is going to be interesting over the next 2 to 3 weeks because we have to put our foot on base. On Wednesday, the Ivy League announced that it was going to make a decision on the 2020 football season by July 8th. Already, at least 4 Division II and Division III programs have canceled their season, with many more likely on the way, administrators say. Many FBS officials describe the spring football season to at least a last resort, but the scenario is picking up steam among athletic directors, and Carter thinks that it was a scenario we talked about earlier on what we talked about, all scenarios. Obviously, it's kind of died down, but we brought student athletes back. But he does hear that discussion is being brought back up more. On Wednesday, the pandemic hung over the committee room. Outside of lawmakers and the 5 panelists, only a small number of guests were allowed, each separated by about 6 feet, and when not speaking, wore masks, of course. Drake, who just moved this week into a post-presidential role at Ohio State, found himself on the receiving end of most of the virus-related questions from lawmakers. He told Rosen that the NCAA Board of Governors is discussing this week the prospect of universal virus health testing plan, that he supports such a move. So Ohio State President Mitchell Drake, and of course we have a bout against him, and Richard Blumenthal, the DC senator, got into it a little bit, and it was only going to happen at some point. They were involved in 2 uneasy exchanges about schools' lack of transparency in positive cases regarding waivers that some schools are requiring their athletes to sign in order for them to work out. While many administrators, Drake included, said the documents aren't legal waivers, others disagree. Blumenthal and Senator Cory Booker, New Jersey, he's the district, or New Jersey, announced Tuesday that they have drafted legislation to prohibit colleges from having athletes sign the waivers. During the hearing, Blumenthal asked each panelist to respond in writing to his bill. And Blumenthal read aloud the passage from Ohio State document, the Buckeye Pledge, that athletes and students will sign. That is, in effect, a waiver from the standpoint of a lawyer, Blumenthal said. Drake insisted that athletes are not going to be waiving their rights to sue by signing the forms, and Blumenthal finished by saying, "I hope the lawyers agree with you," and Drake responded, "I do too." So, about a dozen senators, some virtual, took turns volleying questions toward the panel of 5 witnesses, including SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey, and, like I said earlier, Ole Miss Athletic Director Keith Carter. And while hearing mostly centered on raging debate on athletic compensation, a sidebar quickly formed. The lawmakers are curious about college football's handling of the coronavirus-related matters. Senator Jackie Rosen of Nevada, for instance, suggested that the campus spikes in viral cases are rooted in the absence of universal virus policy. The NCAA should step in and provide a nationwide framework. The hearing unfolded amid a pandemic that has reemerged in outbreaks across the country, putting college football's plans on an on-time kickoff in doubt. At least 5 states have suspended reopening plans, and 4 college programs have temporarily shut down workouts because of outbreaks. At least 150 Division I players have tested positive for the virus, and that number is likely much larger, Blumenthal said Wednesday. Just in the last few days, at least 2 Power 5 football players have used Twitter to publicly question the decision from schools to return to voluntary summer workouts, and there are some growing concerns among officials. Athletic directors fear the potential of large numbers of athletes in quarantine, and officials are rekindling discussions about spring football season, like we just said. So it's getting really bad. They chastised those schools that required athletes to sign waivers and insisted that the NCAA create a universal COVID-19 standard, and laminated the lack of transparency among roughly half of the FBS 130 programs in declining to disclose their case numbers. And that is something that I feel like a lot of people are trying to get behind, and it really marks a lot of the conversations being driven around this whole idea of having spring football, because football in the spring affects so many other things, so much of your revenue and much of the TV market. So football dominates the fall, and that's NFL and college. And college wouldn't survive as much if they battled the NFL. They just have this mutual agreement that college is on Saturdays. Sometimes they do Friday nights, or if it's really special, they do something in the week. But for the most part, their games are played on Saturday all throughout the day. And NFL is a Sunday, Monday, now Thursday sport now. And there is no other sports entity that dominates a week as much as football does. When you own basically 2 days out of the week, and you kind of own a third, just as far as revenue and gathering people's eyeballs to watch your content at all, like for at least a solid 4 to 5 months out of the year, that's incredible, right? Sunday is dominant. Monday night football is a brand. They know what it is. Thursday night football is becoming a brand. College game day on Saturday is a brand, right? It's the brand. People are going to go and watch. They dominate. And when you change from that structure, it's going to be difficult when you have to deal with the fact that you don't know where baseball is going to be as far as college baseball. You don't know where basketball is going to be as far as college basketball, because let's say they move it in the spring. Football season may run into the tournament. That's even if they play. We have no idea. There's no timetable of when we know this virus will be under control and we can get to some semblance of normalcy. And that is tough. That is a demand and a task that most people in the world can't answer, nor do they have the right to answer. We all don't know anything. So putting something like spring football on the table doesn't mean that, oh yeah, we're definitely moving forward with this. It's more so a way of having an out. If this doesn't work out, we have another contingency plan. We have something a framework. We have something to be able to work on that will at least help save some semblance of idea of having a season, because at the end of the day, every sports entity across the planet are all trying to save this year. Nobody wants to go and say, this is it, we're done, we'll try again in a year. Because there's money tied up in stuff. There's contracts that were made years in advance that don't have clauses to protect from things that seemed unnatural and unlikely. I'm sure there's natural disaster clauses. There's things like that in contracts. There's so many different things in contracts that can help give you some relief or can give you insurance. Like, there's no insurance policies on a pandemic. And if there are, that's a really good foresight, but it's really tough. But like I said, Richard Blumenthal and Cory Booker introduced the legislation Tuesday to prohibit colleges from forcing athletes to sign coronavirus liability waivers as they return to campus. And CBS Sports reported Monday that they drafted the bill after sending a letter to the NCAA president, Mark Emmett, last week expressing grave concern for athletes being forced to sign away their right to hold their school accountable. Colleges across the country have asked student athletes to sign these waivers that protect schools from lawsuits if a player contracts to the coronavirus. The waivers emerged shortly after college football programs first began welcoming athletes back for voluntary workouts. Ohio State, SMU, Indiana, Iowa, and others have asked players to sign waivers or pledges in order to begin workouts. Sports Illustrated Ross Dillinger examined the growing concern over the waivers because the players who do not have legal representation are agreeing to waive their legal rights. If athletes don't sign the waivers or don't abide by its terms, they are barred from practice, kept from practice facilities, and risk being cut from their teams. Some worry those factors could cause athletes to risk losing their scholarships. As college football teams return to campuses, some teams have seen high numbers of although testing positive of coronavirus, although many are asymptomatic. Earlier this month, of course, we know Houston suspended all voluntary workouts. We know about Clemson, and we've seen other things like LSU, of course, having issues too. Due to coronavirus concerns, Wake Forest coach Dave Clawson told his players that all activities are voluntary. If a DeMond Deacons player chooses to sit out during the season due to COVID-19 concerns, he's guaranteed all scholarships will be honored. Clawson plans to isolate from his wife, Catherine, a cancer survivor, for the entire season. Doctors said Catherine Clawson's reduced white blood cell count put her at a higher risk for complications if she were to contract coronavirus. So it's not just players that have to deal with some of this stuff. It's coaches too. It's coaching staff. And these guys can have representation. These guys can get lawyers. These guys can get a legal representative to look after them and make sure they're not signing their life away without some form of accountability. And these waivers, these pledges, so to speak, are doing people a disservice and doing student athletes a huge disservice. And this is why people have been chirping about the PA, a NCAA PA, Players Association for College Sports. And it's something that needs to be really considered at this point in time, because this is ridiculous. That is not okay. And I, for one, would be interested in seeing what that even looks like. But the conversation has to be had. But we're going to take our final break, and we're going to come back and talk about the differences between pro sports and college sports.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Okay, so for the last segment, I wanted to touch on an interesting article that I read from SI about why college football return is different from pro sports and vice versa, and what makes them different. So a bunch of their writers from the website decided to touch on this, as the NBA and MLB are poised for a return this season, and the NFL is acting as if things are business as usual. But college sports are a bit different, and they also take place in the fall. But there is some discussion between Robert Lundberg, and he talked with Chantel Powell of Gamecock Digest and Glenn West of LSU Country about how programs are proceeding and asked whether the standard of college sports to be played should be different than those of professional counterparts. So here's a bunch of different people alongside them who also had something to say about this. So Brooks Austin of Dogs Daily: the answer to the question clearly begins with the absence of compensation for collegiate athletes. But to me, it's much more of a conversation about the differences in the protection of the athletes between college and professional sports. At least the professional level, there's at least enough funding to test, trace, and treat each individual case, among with providing an equal level of protection for all the athletes involved. On the collegiate level, however, every program has a different method of taking precautionary measures, along with the different level of funding. Ahmed Gaffer from All Turpins: there's a distinct difference to me. Professional athletes have a contractual agreement to play the sport in return, they're largely compensated with a pair of commas for their annual salary. There is a stronger sense of individual responsibility in pro sports to act as responsible adults. College, not so much. The responsibility ultimately sits with the university where it comes to student athletes. The difference between reopening college versus professional sports stems from the decision for colleges as a whole to reopen this fall. University officials are partnering with state government authorities as they determine their respective plans to reopen schools. But the fate of college sports lies in the ultimate decision to approve reopening each school. In no circumstance can I see college sports continuing if all students don't return to campus. Otherwise, doesn't that defy the definitions of student athlete? Professional teams also have the ability to reopen or close their respective facilities if they choose to, just as Denver Nuggets did on Tuesday, whereas college teams just closed their facilities with a campus full of students. How can they do that? There's more risk to reopening college than professional sports. John Hoover writes from All Sooners, which is funny. Hoover, Sooners. Huh? College and professional sports should have different standards for returning to play from the pandemic. The most fundamental basis for this is that student athletes are a part of a far larger campus community and cannot be sequestered to the extent a professional sports franchise can sequester its athletes. As part of everyday campus community, as athletes who also have classroom responsibilities, the exposure will be far greater. Also, the athletes everyone thinks of in college football and basketball players frequently socialize with athletes from other sports. College sports is just too large, too broad to hold the same standards as professional sports. And that's where I draw the line. I think that people have always found a way to make college football, pro football, just about the football aspect, and we forget just how much payment and compensation and money tie into why sports should come back for different reasons. These professional athletes, be it the NBA, the MLB, NHL, even tennis or anything like that, there are sometimes contracts involved, and the revenue that they can make up for the money, it gets everybody paid. It's not just the owners. It makes the players get able to get their contracts fully realized and see the money that they were supposed to earn. That is a big portion of why they're coming back and trying to play this season, is so that way they can get the dollars that they were contractually agreed upon to go get. And that is really, really important to people who sign these big money contracts because football is a sport of a low shelf life. Running backs don't last long. The only position that lasts long, really, if you're good, is quarterback. And that's if you don't take a lot of injuries. Of course, you can end up taking the Andrew Luck route and you'd be out. Now, Andrew Luck got paid, but most NFL players do phase out in the third year. They don't always make it. NBA players phase out at some point. They don't always get to, most people don't get drafted. Let's keep in mind, getting drafted to the league is hard enough. So bringing it back to college sports, you're not paying these athletes. What do they gain from playing during a pandemic in a rush season that does not feel really legitimate in any aspect, no matter if this competition? Of course, they're going to want to play, right? That's not the point. They're going to want to play, but it's going to be really, really tough to see some form of legitimacy. It's going to feel a little bit bare bones to some degree if they have to change what they do in the season. So maybe they have to go to all conference play and then they go straight to playoffs. That's going to feel different than what they're used to, and it's not going to feel as legitimate. And then there is no clauses created for athletes in the collegiate space in order to keep them accountable for what they do. Because you can't keep people accountable when they are a student athlete. They have to be able to go to classes. They have to be able to go get things. They have to be able to have some semblance of freedom as a student. And if campuses decide to say, okay, we're allowing for the fall, we're allowing students to come back and they participate in certain classes. There's rumors about certain universities having 1 day on, 1 day off classes. So if it's a Tuesday, Thursday class, they only show up once a week or once every other week, or however the case may be, in person. That's still pretty dangerous, and that is an obligation that people may have to do. Maybe they have something in the works where athletes take all online classes and they stay inside. They have to go get food. They have to go to the dining halls, or they have to go to outside eateries, or wherever the case may be to go get food. They got to go get groceries. You can't keep people locked inside a bubble when a bubble doesn't exist. You never created a bubble to exist for college sports. The NFL isn't creating a bubble for it to work. The NFL players have to travel. There's going to be team buses, of course. There's going to be planes. There's going to be hotel rooms. You can't keep people away. There's going to be team dinners. Someone's going to have to cook the meals, and they're going to go into these stadiums with officials and people working around them. It's going to be a lot of things, and we're already seeing some issues with just going into the facilities. Just the facilities. We're having issues with kids coming back testing positive, although mostly asymptomatic, but still testing positive regardless. As asymptomatic, as I like to remind people, is the worst thing, because you may not see the symptoms, but you still carry the virus. Don't you see how problematic that is? Just because you don't see the symptoms doesn't mean that everything is fine and dandy. You could be carrying stuff and you have to isolate yourself, and it sucks. No one wants to do that, especially if you feel like, okay, I feel good. I want to be able to go out and practice with my homies. I want to be able to go out and do what I need to do to get right for the season. It's just not sustainable. It's too hard. It's too many different factors. And once you start the fall semester, it is going to be extremely difficult to backtrack it if things get bad. We're seeing universities in California, after a month of saying, oh yeah, we're going to start with the fall and bring students back, to now they have to backtrack and say, we're going to go strictly to online for fall. And students they have a right to complain about that, because imagine, not just tuition fees. You got to think about living costs. Not everybody lives in campus housing. People sometimes go off campus and sign leases to different campus-wide apartments for students to live in while they are in school. And I guarantee you there are no clauses at this moment in time at those off-campus apartments, because you could sign in one of those and not be going to school. So why would they purposely make clauses that would basically be giving people a free out of their contract? They're not doing that. So what they did was wait to see what the university said, basically fired up like nothing else is going on in the world with advertisements saying, yeah, come sign your lease here. It's closer to school, do whatever, to get people to sign that lease. And now California universities are turning tail. They're turning back, and it feels very bait and switch. And I know a lot of people are feeling some type of way about that. And of course, it doesn't necessarily revolve around student athletics as much as student culture and the collegiate space right now, but it all affects different things, because if you go fully online in the fall, there's no way you can justify bringing collegiate athletes to school. There's just no way. You can't do it because you don't pay them. So what's the difference at that point? What's the difference? How are you going to keep them accountable for their classes online? How do we know if they're doing things when basically they're just there to play football? There's not like they're going to class like it's a summer program where you got kids coming early. They have to monitor what they're doing in their classes. And online work can be very, very tough, especially in an environment where you're taking Zoom calls and you have teachers that have never had to deal with this before. There is so many different variations of why this is vastly different from pro sports. And pro sports, quite frankly, all you have to do is worry about being the best at your position and doing your job. As a collegiate athlete, you have to worry about keeping up your conditioning, being the best physical shape possible, understanding your playbook, knowing your responsibilities on the field, making sure you're at the top of your game so that way the person under you isn't going to usurp your spot. Then, on top of that, you have to worry about your classes and your major specific things. And then other activities if you're involved in. Some people don't have full scholarships. Some people have to work. Some people don't have the opportunity to take, some people aren't taking easy schedules, right? And I mean schedules as in classes. Some people's class structures are very, very difficult for what they need to achieve in order to live out whatever dream that they have, be it play in the NCAA, to play in the NFL or not. Some people go get masters. Some people go and try to become doctors. Some people try to go to law school, and they use the fact that they play football at a high enough level to pay for that. And a lot of those classes are very difficult to do over a Zoom call. It's not that easy. I just think it's going to be very, very tough in order for the NCAA to pull something like this off, especially when every state has different policy. Every state is handling this differently. There's no uniformity about this. In the NFL, all 32 teams are uniform in what they are planning to do. You have 130 FBS schools that are doing 130 odd different things revolving around COVID-19. And that's the biggest issue that we have right now in college football. There is no uniformity. There is no one message. There is no one band, one sound. Thank you for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast today. I'd like to encourage everyone who enjoyed or didn't enjoy this podcast to please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you chose to listen to us. Every bit of feedback is helpful, and I would greatly appreciate it. Please, 5 stars. And don't forget to follow us on our social media, our Facebook and our Twitter at GSMC College Football. That would be great because we love to interact with our fans and our people who listen to us on a weekly basis. So if you have any questions or you have any things you would like us to talk about in the podcast, that'd be great. We take suggestions. We love suggestions here at the GSMC. But with that said, this is the GSMC College Football Podcast on the GSMC Podcast Network. I am their host, Ethan, and I'll see you all next week.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast. part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.